And I'm your favorite magic channel's favorite magic channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck techs. I come correct like a porn star, slicing up all these other suckers with my sword mark.
What's up, my Timmies? It's Dev from Mtg. We like it a magic, and today we got a budget deck that's so sharp, it'll nick ya. Now, one thing I like about Nikya is that in a world full of constantly shifting social and political norms, where we're at each other's throats all the time, and it seems like the concept of time itself is increasingly meaningless, it's good to know that Mana Flare is still aimed at exactly the same audience as it was in 1993. Like, back in the day, Mana Flare definitely had its crowd, but the concept of doubling up your mana is appealing to pretty much any Magic player, so I was excited about building something around Nikya since the first time I saw this thing during spoiler season. Untap with this in play, and oh, the places you'll go. Now, it looks kind of weird to play 4 copies of a legendary 5-drop, but the whole deck is built around it. We're trying to find it every game, and often play it a turn or 2 early, so I want to get this as quickly as possible. 4 copies is the best way of ensuring that we do just that. See you later, bub. Anyway, there's also the fact this card has a pretty big target on its back. Like, your opponent really doesn't want to let you get to your next turn after you play Nikya, and they'll take extreme measures, including using any removal spell they possibly can to get this thing off your side of the table before you're able to get to your next turn. So, huge bullseye on its face. You got to carry multiple copies of this because you'll often need to play multiple copies in a game. That said, though, it doesn't get hit by Lava Coil or Cast Down, and those are really important removal spells right now. So in some ways, it is resistant to very popular removal, but definitely not all removal. So we're going to play the playset. Now, the old ways might remind me of the old days when you used to be able to just play Mana Flare and then fireball your opponent's ugly mug off next turn, but you actually can't do specifically that anymore. This locks us out of playing non-creature spells. So, that said, I think we just go all the way on the non-creature concede. You know, I've seen a lot of people trying to just build this deck in tricksy ways where you do play some instants and sorceries or enchantments, or you're able to kill your own Nikya in some roundabout way, pool a bunch of mana, hit them with Banefire, but I don't think we actually have to go through all that trouble, and I'm kind of excited about this particular deck building conceit. So I'm going to go all the way here and play pretty much nothing but creatures and lands. So to follow up Nikya, I'm going to play Nullhide Ferox, because this also locks us out of playing non-creature stuff. We might as well play 4 copies of this too. I'm not sure what a Ferox actually is, but I know Nullhide. I know what that means. That's when you're playing hide and seek with a Southerner, and you ask them if they want to be it, and they're like, Nullhide. But basically, this card is a 4-mana 6/6, which is all you need to know, but it's also got pseudo hexproof, which is, you know, hexproof might be one of the best abilities in the entire game. You know, we don't care if we get this a turn before Nikya, or if we get it after Nikya, and it only costs us 2 lands to actually put this into play. It's good in pretty much any situation. But did you know, it's actually possible to play Nullhide Ferox in this deck by tapping just 1 land. If you have a Goreclaw, you can pull that off. Now, some of the stuff that Manbear Pig allows you to do in this deck is freaking insane. This goes so super well with Nikya, especially on curve. They curve into one another, which is particularly fortunate. You know, if you go Goreclaw on turn 4, or possibly earlier in this deck, but let's just say we play Goreclaw turn 4, turn 5 we drop a land and then play Nikya for just 3 mana. That means we have 2 open lands, which means we actually have 4 mana, plus any discounts that we get from Goreclaw. So it's entirely possible, feasible at least, in this deck, to go Goreclaw on 4, turn 5, Nikya into double Nullhide Ferox. Plus, like, when it attacks, it sort of anthems all of our big dudes and gives them trample, and big dudes are all the creatures I've shown you so far, plus more to come, so you can get a lot of value out of Goreclaw in this deck. Not only is it a good attacking general, but it's going to discount most of the creatures that we're playing. I'm telling you, like, putting the Algor discount together with the Nikya Mana Flare effect is just kind of broken. You actually get these 2 cards out together, so, especially if you're able to untap with them, because then you can do stuff like double Ravager Worm the next turn if you want to. A Ravager Worm is our Ravenous Chupacabra in this deck. It can come down and just like Beetlejuice, like Sandworm, or I guess Dune if you'd rather that reference, one of our opponent's creatures, and leave behind a huge dude. It's one of the swingiest plays in the entire deck, and it's not too hard to get to. Like, even if you just have Nikya, or if you just have Goreclaw, or even if you just have a couple of Mana Dorks out. There's Mana Dorks in this deck, if you didn't know that already. It's pretty easy to play a Ravager Worm ahead of schedule and just completely wreck your opponent. Like, in a deck that literally can't play spells, it's good to have some creatures that essentially function as spells. It's exactly what this does. It can come down, eat something up, and immediately attack for you sometimes. And that's just one of the best effects we could hope for in a deck that's trying to do exactly what we're trying to do. But there are more big dudes in this deck. I'm playing 1 copy of Varric's Bladewing, because I could not resist, and I actually wouldn't mind another copy of this card. There's plenty of ways to fill out this slot, or Nullhide Ferox's slot, if you don't have either the money or the mythic rare slots, the wild cards on Arena, to play this, you know. I can totally understand if you don't want to waste a mythic wild card on this, you know. So if you don't, then you've got options. You've got Ripjaw Raptor, not a bad call, or you could even just play Vinemare in this slot, and that wouldn't be too bad either. But if you do have an extra Sharpwing Duck or two lying around, it goes pretty well in this deck. You know, alongside Nikya, you only have to tap 4 lands to kick this into play. And I do think that Kicker is a sly, kind of tricky way of using the extra mana from Nikya. So I like a lot about this card in the deck. And besides that, if you don't have a Nikya out, then if you have a Goreclaw instead, it only costs 6 mana to kick this into play and get all 8 power. So there's lots of ways to actually get this kicked in the deck. And 8 flying powers, it seems pretty good to me. But we're not quite done with dragons yet, actually. We're playing 2 copies of Skargan Hellkite here. And there are other ways you could fill this slot, too. There's actually a lot of ways you could build this deck. I'll go into even more a little bit later after the sideboard. But other ways of filling this slot that come immediately to mind are things like Demanding Dragon and even Regisaur Alpha. Not a bad way to do this at all, but this is probably my favorite. Now, what I like about Hellkite so much is the sync. This gives us another good way of spending any extra mana that we have from Nikya without actually having to play spells in the deck, you know? If you have just 6 lands in play, for instance, then you can activate this 3 times as long as you have a Nikya out, and that's crazy. You don't even have to attack to easily win the game in just a couple of turns with this on the battlefield, or you can just pick off your opponent's creatures one by one by using this thing's activated abilities. So again, I think it's really important to have a sync like that for all the extra mana we have in this deck, and you really couldn't ask for a better one than Hellkite. But we gotta have a big finish somewhere in this deck. I mean, what is all this mana, you know, to use for if we don't have at least one really expensive creature in here? So I'm going to play the Big Pig Inraze Forerunners here just as a 2 of, because I really don't want to get like multiple copies of this in my opening hand. I don't even really want 1 copy of this in my opening hand. So I don't think we have to play a bunch of these, but it is really nice to get one down on turn 6 after your Nikya. And really, if you untap with Nikya in play and then play the pig, then you can swing for 14 right then and there, even if those are your only 2 creatures. With Trample and Vigilance too, by the way. So that seems good, but you're bound to have at least another dude or 2 on the battlefield, any mana dorks you can play. So this is just a great way, because it effectively only costs 4 mana. To use any extra mana that you do have laying over from Nikya, and it's a great way to follow up Nikya too. But for every dino, there's a dork, so let's look at our mana acceleration package here in the deck. We're playing 4 copies of Llanowar Elves, good old tried and true Llanowar Elves, 4 copies of Elvish Rejuvenator, and 4 copies of a weird one, Draconic Disciple. But I do like this thing. It may be 3 mana for a mana dork, but that's fine. This will fix our mana either way. It produces any color, which I do like, and it is relevant kind of a lot of the time. Plus, this will accelerate us into Nikya on turn 4, which is really all we're looking for anyway, so I don't mind a 3-mana dork in the deck so much. Plus, once we do have a Nikya down, this obviously just converts into a 5/5 really easily, and I like that. I like that a lot. As far as Rejuvenator, there's a couple of weird edge reasons I'm playing this card over some other things we could play. One reason is because it's a mana dork that we don't actually have to tap to get juice from. You know, this puts another land into play, which is exactly what we're looking to do once we get Nikya. Lands are especially important in this deck, and we want them in a lot of ways more than mana dorks. And we are also playing Inraze Forerunners in this deck. I want to be able to just tap lands to play Forerunners. I don't necessarily want to have to tap creatures that we actually want to attack with that same turn when we play Forerunners. So I want lands instead, and this will get us that, rather than a mana dork that we'd actually have to tap and take out of combat. Now we got 4 more slots to fill in this deck before we can get to the lands here, and I went with Dryad Greenseeker, or Bark Confidant, which is my favorite nickname for this card that I've heard so far. And it's a good comparison, you know, it's not quite like Dark Confidant, it won't get you an extra card every single turn, but it will some of the time, you know, this basically taps to draw a card on occasion, and lands are exactly what we're looking for in this deck. If you wanted to, you could probably just play like Druid of the Cowl in this slot. You know, just another mana accelerant or another mana dork. That's totally fine, but I really like the idea of Greenseeker. I like the idea of blasting through land pockets, helping make sure that we draw actual action on our next turn, especially once we get Nikya down. And of course, fueling our lands until we do get Nikya down in the first place. So, lots to like about Greenseeker. I think it's the right card for this slot. 24 lands in this deck in a budget package right here. Obviously, if you got Stomping Grounds or the cash to play them, you just play those. Same thing with Rootbound Crag. So if you got them, play them. But we get by pretty fine with this package, given that we still have enough green mana sources untapped on turn 1 to play Llanowar Elves pretty consistently, alongside enough red sources to get the few red cards we actually need to play in the deck. To be more specific, we have 16 green sources in this pile and 12 red sources, just enough to feel comfortable with, but I'd feel a lot more comfortable if we could put in the expensive land package and get like 18 green sources and 14 red sources. That said, we get by pretty well, and Memorial to Unity is a pretty decent little budget option that we can play to essentially draw a creature because we know we're going to hit a creature or two. Now here's our sideboard. There is one non-creature card in the entire 75 of this pile, and that's Sarkhan's Unsealing. I will board this in on occasion, especially against other mid-range decks, things like Sultai, because this will just eat them alive in a matter of a couple of turns if we can get it down, and we can just play it before we play our Nikya anyway, if we do happen to get it. So I do like the idea of Sarkhan's Unsealing enough to at least devote one slot to it, but there's other fun ofs here. Obviously, Palaka Worm comes in against lower to the ground aggro decks. If we can actually get to this card, it completely swings the game in our favor, and if they do somehow have some form of removal for it, then we at least get to draw the card so it replaces itself. I like the idea of Palaka Worm, but I'm not going to play a whole bunch of them. Aside from that, more practical stuff includes Crawl Harpooner, just a couple of copies of these because we usually won't play them until the late game, but in a deck that's literally nothing but creatures, it actually won't be too hard to feel Undergrowth. It just kind of happens naturally, so Crawl Harpooner can basically just function as a removal spell, so usually starting in the mid-game. As far as Lightning Mare goes, Thunder Horse is great against control decks, which we do need a little bit of game of against, so we'll side in 3 copies of that. Atsakan Archer is probably the weirdest looking card in this sideboard, but this was actually used at the Pro Tour, so I'm not alone here and I'm not a crazy person. This is used to sideboard in against mono blue decks. This will block and kill pretty much anything in those decks if it's not wearing a Curious Obsession, other than say Tempest Djinn or Merfolk Trickster, but all of their 1-drops this will take out, and it can even shoot down things like Siren Storm Tamer and Pteramander as soon as it comes into play. So there's an awful lot of play on Atsakan Archer. It might not look like it, but this is a great piece of tech against mono blue, and that's a very dangerous deck right now. Thrashing Brontodon is pretty obvious. This is yet another thing we can play effectively as a spell for a total of 4 mana or just 2 lands. If we have a Nikya in play, keep that in mind. Then we can take out any artifact or enchantment, and that is going to be very especially important against the multitude of important enchantments people are playing. It takes too long to list them. There are that many, and I've already listed them in like every video. There's seriously like 10 important enchantments to look out for right now, and Brontodon's good against all of them, so much so that you might find a slot or 2 for this card in the main deck. But moving on, there's also Territorial Allosaurus, which began life as part of the main deck, but moved it into the sideboard so we can more easily deal with mid-range decks. Now, as far as stuff I didn't play in this deck, I've actually already pointed out a bunch of other ways you could utilize certain slots if you wanted to put more money into the deck, or even if you wanted to be more budget for that matter. But there's a bunch of stuff I still haven't touched or talked about yet. Like if you wanted to put more money into the deck, a couple of good places to start would be Crab People, Growth Chamber Guardian, or even Wayward Swordtooth. Obviously, this goes really well with Nikya, but Swordtooth's at like $5 right now, so a playset would cost half of what the deck costs. But that said, got a couple lying around, it fills out the 3-drop slot pretty well. And I don't have to explain Crab People. This is good enough, even if you don't ever get a Nikya out, but if you do, it's a great mana sink for all that extra mana. You could also play Wild Growth Walker and company. Actually, Saffron Olive just uploaded a deck yesterday as I record this. That's a 5-color Nikya deck. It's actually pretty cool, but he's using the Wild Growth Walker package on the lower end of the curve, and I can definitely see why you did that. But that's $40 too, which is exactly what our deck already costs in the first place. So you buy the Wild Growth Walker package, or you can buy this entire deck, and I'd rather keep it that way. But Wild Growth is obviously a pretty good way to spend your early turns in this deck. Aside from that, if you wanted to go a little bit more budget, there's also like Captivating Crew and Sparktongue Dragon. These are both pretty interesting picks. Not too sold on Sparktongue, but if all you have are common wild cards, or if all you have are Sparktongues in paper, it's actually not a bad way to fill the upper slots of this deck if you don't have all those rares. And Captivating Crew is especially interesting. It's like a 15 cent or 20 cent rare right now, and it can just like especially if you've got a Nikya in play, like pick up 2 creatures a turn and just decimate your opponent with their own creatures. So you're just basically 2 for 1ing them turn after turn, at least in combat. So it's just a crazy idea. Didn't really test it out or anything, but I like mana sinks in this deck. I've been pretty clear about that, and Captivating Crew is one that you might want to try. But lastly, here, before I get to the power rankings, one thing I've seen a lot of people talk about doing is making this deck Naya. Green and red and white is the color you add, so you get cards like Shalai and Zakama. Zakama is the one that I've heard brought up the most when people talk about, like, you know, you cast Zakama with a Nikya in play, and then you use Zakama after you untap your lands. You use Zakama to kill your own Nikya with that, you know, red ability on her. And then you play Banefire after you pull the rest of your mana. That seems really circuitous and almost like it's never, ever going to happen, but I do have to admit, you can play Zakama with only 5 lands if you have a Nikya out, and that is really, really attractive. That's a good proposition. So I like that idea a lot, and if you're going to make the deck Naya, it's definitely the first card you'd include. But Shalai is also a really important inclusion because, like I said earlier at the beginning of the video, Nikya just has an enormous target painted on his back, and Shalai can help keep the heat off of him. And here are your power rankings right here. Final score of 60, not too bad, for a deck that's only going to cost you about $35 to $40 on TCG Player right now. Pretty cheap, especially with that mana base, which still services us pretty well, and it lets us play a bunch of really powerful cards, especially on the top end. If you really look at the way the deck is constructed, it's basically a traditional ramp deck. Lots of mana dorks and stuff on the low end, plus we get Dryad Greenseeker to actually help us effectively draw cards in this deck. On the low end, all of that's pretty nice, but in just a few turns, we're going to get to playing Nullhide Feroxes and Nikyas and stuff. Like, we can play Ferox on turn 3 in this deck really, really easily. You know, turn 4, we can play Nikya really easily as well. So we got a lot of action in the relative mid-game in this deck. So even though we're kind of slow to start, once we get to turn 3, 4, 5, we're doing some really, really powerful stuff for that point in the game. And even if you're not, like, comboing off in this deck, it's still like a rampy mid-range deck, you know? You can just go Goreclaw into Ravager Worm and just attack them. That's totally a possibility, too, you know? You're dealing a boatload of damage to them, in that case, with just a couple of creatures, and you got one of their creatures off the board. So again, even if you're not putting together, like, fancy Mana Flare combos or anything, and just, like, crossing your fingers, hoping and praying you get to untap with Nikya and play, this deck isn't necessarily all about that. Sometimes this deck is just about landing Ferox into Ferox and swinging at their face a bunch of times. It does that pretty admirably, too. Plus, you get to play all the Timmy cards for only, like, $40. You know, just looking through the list here, it seems like this should be a more expensive deck. Nikya should be more than a quarter. Nullhide Ferox should be more than $3.50. Skargan Hellkite, should be more than $4. You know, this looks like a $100 deck, but no, it's only like $40. That's it, and it lets you play a buttload of really, really powerful stuff. So try this thing out. Super low price over on TCGplayer.com. You know them by now. They sponsor my content. They're good to you, boy, but they're also good to you, man. They are the lowest price that you're going to get this deck on all of the interwebs. So click the first link in the description box below me. Go over there, pick up anything you need, or just check out the deck list. And also, you know what time it is, y'all. YouTube stuff. Do the thing. Hit the button with the likes on it. And also, subscribe if you haven't done that yet. What are you doing? What are you waiting for? You watch me all the time. I know that not everyone subscribes to YouTube channels. Not everyone is that person. But just this once, do your man a favor and hit subscribe and then hit the bell for the notifications. I know it's asking a lot that you click 2 things. I don't like clicking 2 things, but just do it this one time for your dude. But aside from that, if you really want to be good and to your boy, and I know nobody does this either. No, this is a really big ask, but if you just have $1 every 30 days, go over to the Patreon, link in the description of that, throw it to the channel, and I'll help you get some value for your dollar. You know, $1 is some French fries at a fast food joint. Or you could spend that $1 to help vote on what decks you want to see next on this channel, and I'll let you know what decks and videos and stuff we're doing 24 hours in advance. Just $1 for all that crazy value. So hit the link if you possibly can, but I'm pretty sure that I'm done pitching to you at this point. I know you detest being pitched to. I apologize, but it's part of the job. It's part of the thing. I gotta do it, guys. But I hope you do any of those things, even if just this one time. But in any case, like, I can't pretend that I hope you don't do it. I really hope you do it, and if you're still here, I'm glad you sat through this pitch. But in any case, I'm pretty sure that's done. Unless you want to follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev. Social media pitch. I wasn't done. But Anyway, I think that's it for now. So just let me know how you felt about this thing down there in the sideboard, the comments section. Anything I didn't play, which I've already admitted is a bunch of stuff. But if I didn't bring something up, let me know. Anything you do differently. Are you playing this deck right now? And how are you doing it? I want to know. So I read your comments. So get down there. Sound off. Anyway, I think I'm actually done now. I think I'm done blabbering. So I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.